Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Hannah Gaydonay, U.S. Director of Humanity and Inclusion, and it is my pleasure on behalf of the U.S. Campaign to Ban Landmines and U.S. Cluster Munition Coalition to welcome you to today's webinar, Progress in the Face of Headwinds, Achieving a World Free of Landmines and Cluster Munitions. Today's conversation comes at a critical moment when the stakes could not be higher in our fight to end the use of landmines and cluster munitions. Since 2024, we have seen the US reverse course on the transfer of landmines. We've seen multiple European countries leave the landmine treaty. We've seen cuts to US government funding for demining and victim assistance. And we have seen the increased use of these deadly weapons in ongoing conflicts. Despite the challenges we face, we believe that the United States can demonstrate their leadership and that matters more now than ever. While we have not joined the landmine or cluster munitions treaties, we have traditionally aligned our practices with the treaty, thus setting an example for others to follow. We have long been one of the largest funders of mine clearance and victim assistance, investments that not only directly save lives, but also restore livelihoods and help communities rebuild. I'm deeply grateful to today's speakers for lending their voices to this cause. Their expertise and vision for the future demonstrate that ending the scourge of landmines and cluster munitions is not only possible, but within reach, if we choose to lead. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker. I am so pleased to introduce Congresswoman Sara Jacobs, who represents California's 51st District and is now in her third term in Congress. She serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where she's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa and on the House Armed Services Committee. She also helped launch the Protection of Civilians in Conflict Caucus and serves in leadership roles across several caucuses focused on equality and emerging technologies. Before coming to Congress, she worked at the United Nations, the State Department, and UNICEF on conflict prevention and stabilization. She's also the founder of a San Diego coalition focused on ending child poverty. So we're honored to have her with us, and we'll hand it over for her recorded remarks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, and thank you to all the partner organizations for convening us. Like all of you, I believe that weapons that can't distinguish between a soldier in battle and a child playing have no place in a moral or modern military strategy. Without question, cluster munitions and landmines fall in that category. Cluster munitions scatter hundreds of tiny bomblets across a wide area, many of which fail to detonate on impact. Those unexploded bomblets can sit for years or decades, turning farmland, neighborhoods, and playgrounds into lethal minefields. From Laos to Ukraine, we've seen the same heartbreaking pattern. Long after the fighting ends, civilians, mostly children, are killed or maimed while doing everyday activities. Last year, children accounted for 42% of all recorded casualties from cluster munition remnants. These weapons don't just endanger and end lives. They set back economic development, block post-conflict recovery, and keep entire communities locked into a war mindset and trapped in fear. Landmines create the same legacy of indiscriminate harm. They don't know when a war is over. They don't know the difference between a combatant and a civilian. Around the world, landmines continue to kill thousands of people every year, decades after they were buried, often by groups or actors who are no longer alive for goals that no longer exist. That's why it's long overdue for the United States to join the rest of the world and end the use, sale, and distribution of these weapons. Many of our closest partners and allies have recognized that the humanitarian cost of these weapons far outweighs any alleged tactical benefit. We should stand with them. An argument that I often hear from my colleagues is that our adversaries are already using these weapons, so why shouldn't the US provide them or use them ourselves? But if we abandon our values when it becomes inconvenient, we undermine our ability to be trusted and credible when we need to build durable coalitions to solve the world's biggest challenges. And it gives our adversaries a powerful recruiting tool and environment while making our partners question if our word is worth anything. To be clear, banning cluster munitions and landmines would not weaken our national defense. We have the best, most advanced military in the world. We have more precise alternatives that can achieve our objectives without leaving behind a lethal footprint for the next generation to suffer. Any perceived short-term utility of these weapons falls far short of the actual long-term harm they inflict on our credibility, humanitarian values, and global security. That's why I've worked in a bipartisan way over the past several years to prevent the transfer of cluster munitions to any country. While we haven't been successful yet, we've seen support grow with each vote that we had in the 118th Congress. And I'm hopeful that with the new information and findings in the 2025 Landmine Monitor Report, we can build even more support to end the use, production, and transfer of these weapons. So thank you all for your partnership on this important issue. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. It is an honor to be doing this life-saving work alongside all of you. Thank you.
A huge thanks to Congressman Jacobs for setting the stage for our conversation today and for her leadership in pushing the U.S. to stand against the use of these deadly, indiscriminate weapons and remain true to our values. Next, we have remarks from Congressman Jim McGovern, who represents the 2nd District of Massachusetts. He's a longtime champion for ending hunger, protecting human rights, and advancing peace, particularly in ending the use of landmines and cluster munitions. As the top Democrat on the House Rules Committee, where he also served as its chair, he worked to make the House more transparent, more open, and more accountable. On the Agriculture Committee, he's driven major national efforts to end hunger, including helping secure the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health. His leadership on human rights spans global accountability legislation and service on commissions monitoring abuses worldwide. His commitment goes back to his early work investigating atrocities in El Salvador, which helped shift U.S. policy. Congressman McGovern brings decades of leadership on this issue, and we appreciate him joining us today. Congressman, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me to offer remarks for this event on the human costs of landmines and cluster munitions. I welcome the publication of your 2025 Cluster Munition Monitor and Landmine Monitor Reports. The information in these reports has been invaluable to me and other policymakers over the years. As you have documented so well, landmines and cluster munitions cause indiscriminate harm. Not only do they maim and kill civilians, they inhibit communities' economic development, food production, and sense of safety. We often think of the dangers of these munitions as a legacy of wars fought decades ago, like in Vietnam and Laos. But they are also used in many of today's conflicts, such as Ukraine and Myanmar, sowing the ground with hidden dangers that will injure or kill people far into the future. I strongly believe that the United States must be an international leader in ending the terrible toll on civilians caused by landmines and cluster munitions. We have a duty to act. The suffering caused by these weapons is something we should not tolerate. In fact, we should commit to end it. There will always be those who argue for their necessity, just as there were people who argued to keep mustard gas and chemical weapons. They were and are on the wrong side of history. Unfortunately, some are moving backward. Fearing further Russian aggression in Europe, some of our allies are reconsidering the goals of the Mine Ban Treaty and Cluster Munitions Convention. War-torn Ukraine has become the most heavily contaminated country in the world, with millions of mines scattered across the landscape. Make no mistake, we stand with our allies for our friends in Ukraine and against Putin's territorial ambitions. But we should not cede the moral high ground by criticizing Russia's actions only to emulate them ourselves when faced with difficult choices. Congress should align U.S. policy with the Mine Ban Treaty and Cluster Munitions Convention. We must help reignite the global consensus to ban these weapons once and for all. This may be difficult in today's political climate, but when confronted with the moral imperative, we cannot stand down. I'm encouraged to see many gathered today for the launch of the 2025 Monitor. You have my commitment to work together towards a future free from these horrific munitions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman McGovern, for continuing to add your voice to the call for the U.S. to join the Landmine and Cluster Munition treaties and to continue our life-saving work. We hope that your colleagues in Congress will join you in pushing this mission forward. Next, we will hear from several live speakers. We welcome you to drop in your questions for the speakers into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And so our first speaker is joining us from Syria. We have had a little bit of difficulty with his connection this morning, so hope that he will be able to join us with audio, if not also with video. But I'm pleased to welcome Bilal Aboud. Bilal is an active member of the Victim Assistance Technical Working Group in Syria, part of the Mine Action Coordination led by Humanity and Inclusion. He currently works with the United Nations Mine Action Service and brings both strong communication skills and significant field experience. His work underscores the importance of inclusion and the leadership that survivors of exploded ordnance bring to mine action efforts. We are so grateful to have his perspective from Syria today. So Bilal, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's hope the connection gods are in our favor today.
I hope so. Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for having me today. And I hope the connection is good and we can keep the camera on. Thank you for having me. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today with hope of reflecting the reality from the ground and convey channel Syrian voices and feelings. My name is Bilal Aboud. I'm 27 years old in my final year of studying civil engineering. I'm originally from Deir ez-Zor, but currently I'm living in Damascus. I've been working in the humanitarian field for more than 4 years now. Started as an outreach volunteer, later as a victim assistance focal point, then in a grants and public relations office, and currently mines and unexploded risk education facilitator. And despite the fact that I grew up in a conflict-affected area, and as many young Syrians, explosive ordnance was part of my daily reality. In 2017, while I was pursuing my academic journey in Damascus, I got injured by an explosive device in a city which was considered the safest one in Syria. Yet the blast resulted in the amputation of both of my legs below the knee. I can say that the recovery journey wasn't easy. I endured sleepless nights where no painkiller, even morphine, some nights couldn't ease the pain. Pain drained my body energy to the point I passed out. Only collapsing into unconscious gave me the rest. I don't still yet. There's a lot different things happened. I can say still unhealed scars of the loss of my friend, the college years that I lost. Yet the darkest point was when doctors, and I'm here quoting what they have said, told me that amputation is inevitable. There's no way out. And they literally said prosthetic legs will be more efficient than your current and futuristic medical state of your legs. I don't think that there is a word that can describe how I felt back then. I might go with desperate knowing that I'm living in a country where basic services are limited or even unavailable, like a proper medical surgeries, medication where even harder to find it. And if you find it, would be double, triple the price. Physical rehabilitation is something imaginary. Physical, psychological support also. And the most important thing that the infrastructure of the city, of the country, isn't, let's say, friendly with such cases of disability. Sadly, I settled for the idea that my academic, professional journey had ended, were gone. That's why I said there is no word can describe what I felt back then. Thank God that life full of milestones, major turns, I call them miracles. And that's 100% applies to my story. Life took a major turn that changed everything when I was enrolled in victim assistance program. They funded my healing journey, they call it. I call it my coming back journey. I traveled to Lebanon. I got access to proper medical surgeries under the supervision of a great group of doctors. I got physical rehabilitation, psychological support, and of course, assistive devices, which is prosthetics. The main job or the main object goal of the prosthetics is to regain my independence. But I would like to say that the whole package of services that offered to me regained my spark, gave me the chance to find a way out of misery, find a way forward, a new meaningful life. And I'm just a story of thousands, and I'm just a piece of a bigger picture. The picture is called Syria. Syria, my beloved country, a country is considered now as the second most contaminated country in the world, despite the fact that Syria entered a new chapter following in 24. We cannot forget that Syrians themselves paid the highest price. Turnabout, financial develop, lifelong disability, displaced camera, millions of displaced people. And yet, even though the war ended, unfortunately, the suffering is still roaming all around Syria. The dream of Syrians of a safe, promising future of their country, and millions of refugees of going back to their lovely houses and neighborhoods are hindered by the presence of ghosts of war, mines, and cluster munitions, other unexploded ordnance, causing the death and serious injuries to children and adults alike. Between December 2024 and November 2025, over 149 incidents were recorded, resulting in more than 1,568 casualties, including 581 people killed, among them 163 children. This means that about one-third of the victims are children, and that's only by considering, disregarding, ignoring that every time a caregiver, a parent is killed or injured, their children are forced to leave the school, forced to lose their promising future, their dreams, and forced to work child labor to help their families secure their needs and getting abused just for some nights, offering a piece of a bread on the table of their family. Have securing the needs of their family is still impossible mission. Syrians wake up every day to the news of a child or an adult being injured by an explosive ordnance while going about their daily activities. These incidents are a painful reminder that even the simplest dreams remain far out of reach for Syrians. The real figures are definitely higher, not only due to limited access in many areas, but also because there is no unified or comprehensive system to collect and verify data across all parts of Syria. We should not also forget that 15.9 million Syrians need healthcare and 14.6 million are food insecure, but only a fraction is being reached. Education is equally critical with 7.8 million child in need, but only 3.3 million targeted for support. And now with the cuts to humanitarian funding, even the most basic services are becoming harder to reach. Trauma care, physical rehabilitation, psychological support, and even clearance itself. When these vital supports shrink, people are left to face their injuries alone. Families go deeper into hardship, and the cycle of injury, disability, and poverty grows even heavier. It's not just a gap in services, it's a gap in hope. So, to reduce the impact of contamination and protect communities in Syria, we urgently need immediate flexible funding and increased investment in mine action, scaling up clearance operation, particularly in areas of return, and expanding explosive ordnance risk education in accessible formats for children, families, and persons with disability. Sustained investment in victim assistance, including physical rehabilitation, mental health and physical support, prosthetics, education, social inclusion, and most important, livelihood opportunities. It's more important to reinforce meaningful participation of survivors in program design, policy development, and decision-making. Humanitarian organizations remain fully engaged, but meaningful progress depends on sustained international investment to ensure safety, dignity, and recovery for survivors and affected communities. My message to US policymakers today is mine action isn't a standalone activity. It's a prerequisite and a key enabler for progress of each phase of recovery, starting with the delivery of a humanitarian assistance to the rehabilitation of infrastructure and the return of displaced population. Where land, housing, and infrastructure units are unsafe, reconstruction definitely is impossible. Investing in mine action is therefore an investment in the future of Syria itself, restoring the conditions under which all other sectors can operate safely and sustainably. At the end, I consider myself lucky to have received treatment and access to healthcare services, but there are hundreds of thousands who have not. And this is the reality we cannot turn away from. Thank you for giving me the space to share my experience and standing with survivors of landmines and cluster munitions everywhere. Together, we can ensure that no more lives are shattered by weapons that should never harm civilians. Thank you a lot, and that's it.
Thank you so much, Bilal, for sharing your experience, sharing your coming back journey, and the ways that you were able to regain your spark through the support that you received, and for telling this your story so that we can see that within the larger context of what's happening in Syria. I think it's really valuable for us to realize that some of the data that our next speaker is going to present really aren't just numbers. They're real life people and their lives and their communities that are impacted by the use of these weapons. So thank you so much. Appreciate you trying to find a place where we could hear you and that the technology would work. So again, thank you. So next, I am pleased to welcome Mark Hisney from Human Rights Watch, where he serves as an associate director in the Crisis, Conflict, and Arms Division. Mark is widely known for his expertise on weapons, military operations, and the humanitarian consequences of their use. He has contributed to and edited extensive reporting on landmines, cluster munitions, incendiary weapons, and other arms that endanger civilians, and has been part of the Landmine and Cluster Munition Monitor since 2000. Before joining Human Rights Watch, he worked on arms control analysis and treaty implementation for U.S. government agencies, and his decades of experience span field research, policy engagement, and treaty monitoring. So over to you, Mark, to share some of the latest findings from the most recent reports. Thanks.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks for everyone who is interested in this subject and wants to keep working on it after so many years. I'm going to throw a quick slide up, hopefully, here. I tend to go very fast and I tend to rattle on. I don't intend to read this word for word, but I want to give you some notes to take away from this at least. The Landmine Monitor 2025 was released in Geneva on Monday. It's the 26th version of this publication. The headline coming out was a spike in the number of victims globally. People were killed or injured by landmines in ERW in 2024. And it's about 6,300 people. There's a couple reasons behind this data. First of all is the ongoing armed conflict with Russia and Ukraine. The other one is the opening and the change that has gone on in Syria. The mine action and contamination challenges there are, I think, much graver than we thought before the transition. We, on clearance statistics and casualty statistics, we're working on the previous calendar year. So what we're reporting on right now are totals for 2024. These are not 2025 because it's not over yet, totals. So you balance that a little with being too current. The second noticeable point was a decrease in actual clearance as opposed to non-technical survey methods of doing land release. There were 1,200 square kilometers of contaminated land cleared in 2024. 80% of that was through non-technical survey. So there's been this cliff wherever the clearance assets have gone and how they're working. So that was an anomaly that came out quite clearly in the data. As the monitor was launched earlier this week, thus also began the 22nd meeting of states parties of the Mine Ban Treaty, and they have a full agenda to do. Not only the regular business of implementation and compliance and dealing with extension requests and stockpile destruction deadlines, et cetera, et cetera. We're dealing with legal situations here that are quite head-scratching and still quite unresolved. During the summer, Ukraine notified other states' parties through a communication to the Secretary General of the UN, saying that they were going to, quote, suspend the operation of the treaty, unquote. People are puzzled about what that means and what the legal ramifications are and whether it's lawful to do with the rationale provided by the Ukrainian government. I'm hoping they're having very uncomfortable discussions right now today on this very subject. Ukraine is problematic, which leads us to other areas of the implementation and compliance in this area. We all know that Ukraine requested and received transfers of landmines and cluster munitions from the United States in the previous years. We had a export moratorium, but there's legalities, et cetera, that have permitted the transfers to go through. And we have seen indications, or we have seen duds of US-made anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions being used by the Ukrainian government. In terms of other related areas here, there are 5 other states, the 3 Baltic states plus Finland and Poland, that have notified the Secretary General that in accordance with Article 20 of the Mine Ban Treaty, they are withdrawing. The process is justified by the state party and goes into effect 6 months after the notification is received. So the Baltics will be out by the end of this month, and then Poland and Finland over January and February. We're subtracting now in universalization. We had reached 166 states parties this year with the addition of the Marshall Islands and Tonga. 31 states have not joined, and that list is pretty rock steady over the years. There is worry that other states, especially ones close to the border of Russia, will begin to also consider withdrawal, which is not a very healthy approach to international law. Where anti-personnel mines have been used in the past year plus this year, we're a little different on this time scale. Extensive use by Russia and Myanmar. Those are the 2 biggest areas where mines are going into the ground quite extensively. There's much more smaller activity by Iran and North Korea along the respective borders, basically sealing off people from escaping from the country, but the mines travel and end up in China and South Korea. So hence we know North Korea is emplacing mines fairly regularly on its border. Also of interest in showing up in Ukraine were cluster munitions of North Korean origin. We were able to identify them. We're not sure who used them, whether it was North Koreans, Russians, or anyone else, but it is the first time we've seen North Korean landmines, or North Korean cluster munitions. Sorry, I perpetually confuse the two. We still have a dirty dozen producers on landmines. Some countries make sense there, some are head scratchers. We're only pretty sure that active landmines are coming off production lines in India, South Korea, Russia, probably. So all those states are not actively producing, but they haven't withheld. 94 states have completed the destruction of their stockpiles. So much for this treaty, not including the countries that have the weapon. And they've destroyed over 55 million anti-personnel mines in part of stockpile destruction, which is much more inexpensive to do as opposed to mine clearance. Destroy stockpiles is easier. I've touched very briefly on cluster munition topics. The cast of characters is also usually the same. For example, people using cluster munitions in the previous year are Russia, Ukraine, and then adding Myanmar, Syria. The Syria was before the fall of the previous regime, so that just got caught up in the calendar. We have an odd situation where Thailand and Cambodia are in a border dispute and Thailand's accusing Cambodia of emplacing mines, which is a very sensitive subject there. This topic is being dealt with by Article 8 of the treaty. Hopefully they can come to a good solution at the meeting this week. I would like to end on, and we have a different paper that's outside the monitor, but it's a fact sheet that's now published, is a first swipe at trying to figure out the impact of the U.S. funding decision on the global situation. We have not been able to get good numbers for the United States. WRA wasn't able to produce them. To Walk the Earth in Safety, which is the State Department publication, which has the funding data in it, was not published this year. And just as we were in final editing, trying to get something out, the US government shut down and we were not able to get any data from WRA. So with that huge caveat, you could see some numbers there that we did the research on with 10 international mine action operators to try to understand the impact on their programs of this. I don't know if we can't come to one number or one conclusion or one tangible area, but this is clearly going to shift the economics of the sector. And we're also concerned that situations like Ukraine are becoming a magnet for funding. The majority of mine action, international donors, mine action funding is heading towards Ukraine and not other countries that may have smaller problems, but still need to either complete their clearance obligation or just reduce casualties too. So that's an attempt at 15 minutes or so of Landmine Monitor. We could have a really wicked pub quiz with this if you all want. There's a lot of data in here. There's a lot of products. There's a report, a printed report, the online report. There's country profiles. There's major findings. There's a fact sheet on landmines and children that we prepare for UNICEF, and there's the fact sheet on U.S. funding. All of that can be found on the USCBL-USCMC website. And with that, I punt back to Hannah and thank her graciously.
Thank you so much, Mark. As Congressman McGovern mentioned in his remarks, this data is just so valuable for us to understand the magnitude of the harm that these weapons cause. So huge thanks to you and all of those that work at Cluster Munition Report and the Landmine Monitor for presenting today and for releasing all of this information in a really challenging environment. So I know that the 2025 data will be probably just as challenging to pull together, but thank you for your hard work on that. Next up, I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Ursula Knudsen-Lata, the Legislative Director for Peace Building at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. She works directly with Congress to advance policies that prioritize peace building and conflict prevention. She's held key policy and advocacy roles at Safer World and the Alliance for Peace Building, and has helped lead several coalitions, including the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, and the U.S. Campaign to Ban Landmines and Cluster Munition Coalition. We're delighted she's here, and I will pass it over to you, Ursula, to share a little bit more on the policy landscape around landmines and cluster munitions in the U.S.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Mark and Bilal, for your comments. To begin, I'm just going to give a little bit of a stage setting on where we sit on U.S. policy on anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions, and then talk a little bit about the impact that has had globally. So to begin with, despite calling for the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty, the U.S. has not acceded to the treaty, nor the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Current U.S. policy on cluster munitions was issued by President Trump in 2017. This policy allows the U.S. military to use all cluster munitions in existing stockpiles without geographic exception, and enables acquisition of cluster munitions from foreign sources to replenish stocks. In fact, the U.S. is among only 17 countries that still reserve the right to produce these munitions. And while the last U.S. manufacturer stopped production in 2016, we are seeing funding go toward developing replacements. And in the last publicly reported data, as Mark said, finding the data can be tricky sometimes. In 2011, the U.S. reported that it had a cluster munition stockpile of more than 6 million. And while the U.S. prohibits the transfer of cluster munitions with a failure rate greater than 1%, we have seen some of those transfers happening. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So U.S. policy on cluster munitions is really out of line with the convention, with the global consensus. It is allowing the use of these weapons, it is allowing for the stockpiling and for the acquisition of these weapons. The view on anti-personnel landmine policy is slightly better. First, in 2020, the first Trump administration announced a revised policy on the use of landmines, which allowed the U.S. military to develop, produce, and otherwise acquire anti-personnel landmines, to use them without geographic limitations, and moved the authority to deploy them out of the hands of the military's civilian leadership and to the military combatant commanders. However, 2 years later, in 2022, President Biden announced a near global ban on anti-personnel landmine use by the U.S. military. However, it did maintain an exception on the Korean Peninsula. This exception has dogged the U.S. Since the Mine Ban Treaty was first being negotiated, and the 2022 policy maintained it. And this 2022 policy did require the U.S. to comply with key parts of the Mine Ban Treaty, including a prohibition on the use, development, production, acquisition, transfer, and stockpiling of these indiscriminate weapons, and set the goal of ultimately acceding to the Mine Ban Treaty. As of today, we are still operating under the 2017 cluster munitions policy and the 2022 anti-personnel landmine policy. However, policy is just paperwork if there is no implementation. And that is where the U.S. has significantly fallen short in the last several years. First, the U.S. has actively transferred cluster munitions to Ukraine, making at least 7 transfers since July of 2023, despite bipartisan opposition in Congress. And while the U.S. Department of Defense officials assert that cluster munition that were being transferred had dead rates less than 2.35%, the testing data supporting this claim remained classified and is likely wildly different than failure rates in combat conditions, and remains greater than the 1% failure rate restriction set by Congress. Further, in November and December of last year, the U.S. transferred anti-personnel landmines to Ukraine, breaking its export ban that it had in place since October 1992, and going against current U.S. landmine policy. The administration did not disclose the types and quantities transferred, and the decision did, receive international condemnation for this transfer. And I want to talk a little bit why these transfers are so bad, why the decision by the U.S. to continue to create space for the use of these weapons is so harmful. First, there is little tactical or strategic value to these weapons. A 2002 report by the GAO on the use of landmines in the Gulf War found that the Department of Defense did not provide any data to indicate either directly or indirectly that U.S. landmines caused any enemy casualties, equipment loss, or maneuver limitations. They were essentially ineffective in the conflict. And efforts to create smart mines through self-destruct or self-deactivation mechanisms have failed to function as advertised. The GAO found that smart mines deployed in the Gulf War failed at a rate 150 times higher than the Department of Defense initially reported. And in fact, these self-destruct smart mines have been deployed by Russia in Ukraine and created terror among the civilian population. According to one survivor in a New York Times report, his farm was hit by scatterable landmines. The bursts, as he says, quote, "The burst continued throughout the day with intervals of around 50 minutes. The last one was 3 o'clock the next night after it first landed. It was lucky the kids didn't play in the backyard that day. Normally, they would play in the backyard at that time as the first pieces were detonating, but it was a rainy day that day." And so even where we have these smart mine technologies, even where there are claims that we can solve the problem of these indiscriminate weapons staying in the ground long after conflicts end, we know that they fail at much higher rates than claimed by the DoD. And we know that these failures cause as much terror as the remnants that they leave behind. These munitions cannot distinguish between civilians and combatants. Landmines and cluster munitions that are left behind do not follow ceasefires or peace processes. They lie dormant for decades and continue to inflict suffering on civilians long after conflicts end. And perhaps most concerning about U.S. transfers is that they've helped create a permission structure among our closest allies to begin withdrawing from the Mine Ban Treaty and Cluster Munition Convention. Now, 5 states party, Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland are in the process of legally withdrawing from the Mine Ban Treaty, and Ukraine is attempting to illegally suspend operations of the Mine Ban Treaty while engaged in armed conflict. Additionally, Lithuania withdrew from the Cluster Munition Convention this year. It is the first time a state's party has begun the withdrawal process from that convention. We cannot have arms control treaties that exist only in peacetime. The purpose of these treaties is to prevent the use of these weapons in war. We cannot allow more countries to be withdrawing. However, I do want to highlight a bright spot, and that is Congress. Over the past several years, the House has voted to prevent the transfer of cluster munitions to any country. And while these votes have not been successful, across 5 votes on the House floor, 221 members of the House voted in favor of at least one of the 5 amendments. 114 Republicans and 107 Democrats. There is a strong bipartisan consensus that the transfer of these weapons goes against our values as a nation. Additionally, the annual SFOPS appropriations bill, or NUSRIP in the House now, Congress has included a restriction on the transfer of cluster munitions with a greater than 1% failure rate. Congress has been clear and it has been bipartisan in its condemnation of these transfers. And we are grateful for the work we've seen over the past several years in Congress. We strongly urge the U.S. to join the majority of the world in acceding to these treaties. And while we are urging and working with the Trump administration to do just that, Congress can and must continue to move the U.S. on a path toward joining these treaties. We urge Congress to pass a statutory ban on the development, production, acquisition, use, retention, stockpiling, or transfer of anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions without geographic exception. Additionally, we urge Congress to appropriate funds for the accelerated destruction of U.S. stockpiles of anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions, and require the Department of Defense to provide a clear timeline and public reporting on this stockpile destruction. And as my colleague Dave will discuss shortly, Congress should continue to assist other states in clearing and destroying landmines and provide assistance to landmine victims and cluster munition victims. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ursula, for joining us and for sharing that background and the next steps that really need to be taken to align U.S. policy with, as you mentioned, with kind of global consensus that we know exists. So thank you for that. Next up, and our final speaker for today is Dave Bloom, who leads Government Affairs for Mine Advisory Group US. Dave works to build bipartisan support in Congress for humanitarian demining and the funding needed to sustain it. His earlier roles include work in congressional advocacy and international policy, and he brings a clear view of the funding landscape and the implementation of demining work and what it takes to move this work forward in Washington. So with that, Dave, I will hand it over to you. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Hope everyone can hear me okay. I'll start by saying the U.S. remains the global leader in humanitarian demining funding. There's several other major country donors, notably Japan, many other countries in Western Europe, as well as the European Union itself. But many of those are facing a downward pressure in competition with rising defense spending. There's also been renewed interest from private donors, especially in Ukraine. But in the US, this funding is appropriated by the annual State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill in the Senate, and now known as the National Security, Department of State and Related Programs Bill in the House. The specific account is called Conventional Weapons Destruction, or CWD. It's located under Title IV of the bill, technically under Security Assistance. CWD is, of course, implemented by the State Department's Office of Weapons Removal and Abatement under the Political Military Affairs Bureau. We heard them referred to earlier as PMWRA. And their programs include funding both for programs of humanitarian mine action as well as weapons stockpile security programs. CWD funding has steadily increased over the years due to broad bipartisan and bicameral support. From FY19 to 23, CWD increased by about 34% with gradual increases along the way. Under the current CR, CWD is funded at $258 million. For FY26, we of course haven't seen the SFOP's draft, but the House NSRP bill would increase this funding by 5.3%, bringing CWD up to $271.703 million. And I think this is particularly impressive given that this is a bill that had an overall cut of about 22%. So to increase CWD, this is, if you're looking for a ray of sunshine, this is very much it. And you know, this is despite a political climate that was quite toxic for most of the year for foreign assistance. CWD support is stronger than ever. An appropriations letter in the House saw a record of 137 signatures, including a record number of Republicans themselves, led by Representative Young Kim of California and Representative Rich McCormick of Georgia. And since I'm naming names here, I have to also highlight the co-chairs of the UXO and Demining Caucus, led by Representative Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania and Representative David Valadao of California, as well as other appropriations letter co-leads, Representative Ami Bera of California and Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. Obviously, it's a long list with 137 just in the House. But I'd also have to mention Reps Jacob and McGovern, who you heard from earlier, who have been steadfast supporters. There's also a small account I'll mention in the Defense Appropriations Bill that supports humanitarian mine action through the development of new demining technologies that are safer and more efficient. There I'd mention the EOD caucus co-chairs, Representative Rick Crawford and Representative Jimmy Panetta for their support. As well as Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. And as all of you working on the Hill know, there's Also, the essential behind-the-scenes support in the appropriations process, which is a crucial conduit for bipartisan and bicameral support for CWD. So for all of that, I sincerely thank everyone still on the webinar who has been a part of all that support. Apologies if I missed any, but I promise the sector very much knows who you are. I'm a little biased here, but to me, it's not surprising why CWD gets so much support. This is a measurably impactful and highly visible form of foreign assistance, I always like to say, and you don't really need an elaborate theory of change to understand it. And with this latest edition of the monitor, I can now update one of my go-to stats, which is that 17 civilians are killed or injured every day from mines and unexploded ordnance. About half of those are children. Not only is demining preventing these casualties, which are horrible in their own right, but these incidents can also disrupt peace building and confidence in fragile governments. This is something we're going to look towards in Syria, particularly at the moment. It's also easy to see how demining and land release connects to so many other development outcomes of interest to many people in the broader sector. Agricultural production, water access, new infrastructure, economic development, self-sufficiency, really all the things that countries can now do with land that was previously unusable. I think people also appreciate the finite nature of the work. Of course, demining can be quite slow and painstaking, but the incremental gains do lead to both micro and macro level wins. 30 countries have been declared mine-free, 17 of them with US assistance. Sri Lanka is a country that's getting pretty close to the point where foreign assistance can sunset and hand off the remaining clearance to the National Mine Action Operator. All of these are really nonpartisan priorities for foreign assistance. So lastly, I just want to mention a couple things to highlight on the horizon in terms of congressional legislation. As I mentioned, we still haven't seen the Senate's SFOPS draft with incredibly high levels of new contamination in places like Syria, Gaza, Sudan, and of course, Ukraine, and shrinking funding from other country donors. We have to capitalize on the support that we've built over the years. At the same time, we can't forget the many other areas of need, which I believe Mark mentioned earlier, which can often be overlooked by various donors. Another point, we did see some great language out of Chairman Mast's House Foreign Affairs Committee, Department of State authorization markup. Many kudos to all in the audience who worked on that marathon session. That was a feat to see. One of the bills that got passed had really great language describing the work of these programs and their benefits. If this bill does go to the House floor or if authorizing becomes a new trend, this is great language to start with. There's also other legislation led by Congressman Barra on war legacies to be on the lookout as that progresses forward. While the sector was relatively spared during the foreign assistance review, one of the cuts we saw, you heard about this earlier, was to a really useful annual report produced by the State Department and James Madison University's Center for International Stabilization and Recovery, called To Walk the Earth in Safety, or TWEAS, as we affectionately call it in the sector. And this provided details about all of CWD spending, all of their programs. I, for one, would love to see this brought back, and I think it's an incredibly useful oversight tool as well. And it would also make the monitor's report much easier, as you heard. Another point to consider would be the Leahy War Victims Fund, which provided that landmine and UXO accident victim assistance that we heard directly benefited Bilal. This was, as opposed to the other work you've heard of earlier, which is under the State Department, that work was under USAID. So to me, it's not at all clear if this work or how this work is going to be picked up now that USAID is gone. There's many more legislation, and of course, many have other ideas, but I'll leave it at for now. Always happy to discuss with anyone interested. So I'll extend my thanks again for Congress's interest and everyone else's interest and support for this work. If there's any folks on the Hill that want to learn more or do more, please do reach out. We need Congress not only to support through this and other legislation, but also by being really vocal and engaged about their priorities for these programs. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Appreciate that viewpoint on the funding. And yes, it's nice to have one bright spot with the CWD funding still remaining at levels that we hope to see continue. So thank you so much for that. Just another note, we have a few more minutes that we can take some questions from you all. So feel free to use the Q&A feature there if you do have a question for any of the speakers. We did receive one question so far around the destruction of U.S. existing stockpiles of anti-personnel landmines, and that this was a pledge during the Biden administration to end those. And one of the participants is asking if there's any update on the U.S. stockpile, and also a question around Biden's pledge to increase funding and research into new technologies to replace anti-personnel landmines, and any progress on that front. So I'm going to hand this question over to you, Mark, to see what you can contribute based on what you're seeing from your perspective.
Hi, thanks. And thanks for the question, Jeff. Over the past years that I've been tracking the quest for alternatives for anti-personnel mines by the U.S., I think the total, R&D funding now is somewhere over $2 billion. There wasn't a great initiative in 22. I'm a little leery of budget justification documents right now from originating from the previous administration, and whether they've been updated to reflect the priorities of the new administration. Back when we were in one of these policy reviews a few years ago, DoD did admit that its stockpile times out, or basically inside these mines are crushable batteries. And after 2030, those batteries are not going to be reliable, nor will the stockpile anymore. So there is a point in time here where the U.S. is not going to be able to safely use its stockpile anymore, safely or effectively use its stockpile anymore, and it will need to get rid of them. The conventional weapons destruction program is its own little universe in DoD. We destroy a lot of ammunition. I don't know what the DMIL account right now stands at, but we're constantly destroying them year for year. DoD, particularly the Army, is not very good at telling the story of it destroying anti-personnel mines. I wish they'd get a little better forward on it, particularly with any Congress people or the congressional delegation from Oklahoma, which is where one of the destruction facilities is. So a little to be determined, Jeff. They did develop, deploy, and it's being out in the field, the M7 Spider munition, which is completely command detonated. It's not victim activated. So the one alternative that did come out of this program to date is not covered by the convention. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. We did have one other question in the background from a participant joining from Rwanda around mine action in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Unfortunately, we don't have any speakers on the call who specialize in the DRC, but I did want to flag that we have been seeing some trends in U.S. funding for demining action moving away from Africa, other funding areas as well, but particularly around demining. So this is a place where Congress could also step up and make sure that the funding prioritizations are happening in all geographic regions that are in need of this funding, to make sure that we're able to clear and return this land to safety for the communities that are impacted by the use of those weapons. So thanks for those questions from the audience. We are a couple minutes over 11, so I think we'll take this opportunity to wrap up, and thank you all for being here today. Really appreciate the expertise, honesty, and commitment that all of our speakers brought to the conversation. Wanted to extend a special thanks to Representatives Jacobs and McGovern for adding their contributions and for their leadership in this arena. We really could not do the work without that leadership. What we've heard underscores a simple truth. The path forward is not inevitable. The global progress we spent years building is not guaranteed to continue, and the setbacks we are witnessing, from the erosion of longstanding norms to the renewed use of landmines and cluster munitions, are just really telling reminders that this work requires constant vigilance. So as we look ahead, our charge is clear. We must continue finding and sharing the data that Mark shared with us. We've got to push back against the harmful policy reversals that we saw Ursula sharing about and Dave sharing about. And we have to continue the life-saving work of deminers and risk education teams that we saw made such a difference in Bilal's life as he was recovering and rebuilding his life after being injured. And we have to insist that every civilian, no matter where they live, has the right to safety, dignity, and a future free from explosive remnants of war. Thank you to all of our speakers, to everyone who worked behind the scenes to make today possible, and to each of you for your commitment to this cause. Your engagement today is part of a much larger effort, one that stretches across countries, sectors, and generations. Let's carry this momentum forward. Let's leave here more determined, more connected, and more resolved to ensure that no more lives are shattered by these indiscriminate weapons. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.